Hello everyone. This is the first in a series of 4 integrative learning lectures over what I call the basics of storytelling. Now I've been teaching for almost 9 years now, and 3 of those years have been devoted specifically to teaching creative writing. And I have noticed over these past 3 years that there's some consistent issues that students inevitably run into. And so this is my way of addressing them and trying to kind of head them off at the pass, get them taken care of, make you aware of it, and help you get past it as early as possible. Because once you figure out how to properly tell a story, you're obviously going to be able to tell better stories. And so in this one, we're going to talk about one of the big things that I've seen in the past, and that's active versus passive characters. Now, you may be asking yourself, why are we talking about this? What's the big deal about passive characters? Well, we'll define our terms in just a minute, but the key thing that you need to understand is that character actions should drive the plot. It shouldn't be the other way around. It shouldn't be that a character is constantly reacting. A character needs to be active. They need to do something. They need to act, as in active. And so, with that in mind, let's go ahead and define our terms. Now, an active protagonist is one who acts. They dictate the story. Their actions seek to change the world around them. And this leads to consequences, and sometimes they do have to react to the consequences that arise from their actions. But the important thing is that they drive the plot. They dictate the plot. The plot isn't dictated to them. A passive protagonist is kind of like Han and Frozen in Carbonite here. A passive protagonist is frozen in time and space. A passive protagonist is one who constantly reacts. Something happens and they react to it. Now, you may be saying to yourself, you may be saying to your screen, well, Dr. Begley, I've read plenty of stories about passive protagonists who react, who don't necessarily do anything. A prime example of this would be Shakespeare's Hamlet. One of the reasons why Hamlet is such a compelling character and such a memorable character in play is that it's all about inaction. And this would be my answer to you. The stories where characters are passive, the whole point of the story is that they're passive. It could be a tragedy like Hamlet. If Hamlet wasn't so indecisive, if Hamlet wasn't so passive, and he's not actually that passive. He does things. He tries to make changes in his world, but more often than not, he reacts and instead of acts. And so we consider him passive. And again, that's the point. You can have a passive protagonist, but that has to be the whole point of the story, and it typically leads to a tragedy. If you don't, a passive protagonist, another way to look at it, is like a video game character. A video game character has no agency of his or her own. The agency all centers around you, the player. You dictate the character's actions. You dictate whether they go left or right, up or down, whether they punch or stab or shoot or whatever it is that you do, whether they pick one branching dialogue or another. The power resides in you, and you're dictating the actions and the plot. And you don't want to have that in a story. You don't want to have that in a work of fiction. You don't want to have that in I should say, a film or a television show. So the obvious question at this point is, why do we prefer active characters? Well, for one thing, it's more exciting. If you see a character who is constantly twisting in the wind, who's constantly letting outside forces dictate his or her behavior, it's not very interesting. I mean, if you have to be a damn good writer to make it interesting, we'll put it that way. We want characters who act, who do things, who try to change the world to make it what they want it to be. Part of this is a certain amount of vicarious identification with the character. Character is the reason that we read stories. The writer John D. MacDonald famously defined a story as something interesting happening to someone you've grown to care about. Both of those parts are important, but if you don't have, but I will make the argument that you can have uninteresting things happen to a character that you've grown to care about, and you still enjoy the story. There are plenty of stories out there that I recognize are not very good in terms of plot and logic and everything else. I'll use the new Star Trek movies as an example, even though the slideshow is all about Star Wars. And if you do, and I'm going to preface this by saying I do enjoy the new Star Trek movies. I'm not one of the haters, but I also see their flaws. And there are some serious storytelling flaws in both movies, more Into Darkness than in the first one. But regardless, I enjoy watching them. I love watching them. And the reason is because of the characters. The actors, the casting in that movie is brilliant. And despite the flaws in plot, the writers get the characters right. And I love those characters so much, and I love the way that the actors bring them to life so much that I can overlook the problems with plot and logic and all the other things I mentioned. And so character is incredibly important. And we want to see characters try and change the world because we want to change the world. There are so many times in our lives when we do feel like a passive protagonist, where we're just, moving from one fire to the other, where we're just, moving in the wind, twisting in the wind, where we have very little control over our own fate. And so we turn to stories as a source of comfort. We may not have a lot of control over the various aspects of our lives. Say you don't like your job. Well, you can read a story about a man who just one day ups and quits his job and goes off and becomes a famous painter, or someone who sails around the world or something like that. Something that, in all practicality, you may not be able to do. But you can experience that life vicariously, and you can take a certain amount of pride and joy in this character's accomplishments because you're identifying with that character. And so, again, active is better. When you are writing, continually ask yourself, is my character doing something? Is my character driving the plot? Or is the plot driving my character? And if you find that it's the other, try to find ways to make it more active. Remember, I don't know, I've said this like 3 or 4 times, but it's important, and repetition's a good tool for teaching. Character actions define the plot, not the other way around. So if you have any questions, please watch and read the supplemental materials on the page. And if you have any questions, or just want to talk about it more, please contact me, and I'll be more than happy to talk with you about it. So I will see you next week.